My name is Natalie Porter. I'm 23 years old, and on the night of my graduation, my parents tried to poison me at my own celebration. It should have been the happiest night of my life. 4 years of grinding through labs, field research, endless data analysis, and professors who treated sleep like a moral failure, all of it was finally over. I had earned my degree in environmental science from the University of Texas at Austin. I had proven at least to myself that I wasn't useless, that I wasn't a mistake. From the outside, my parents looked proud. They rented out the entire rooftop of the Four Seasons downtown. City lights spilled out beneath the glass railing like a carpet of stars. A live jazz band played softly in the background. The tables were dressed in white linen and imported flowers that probably cost more than my first car. Anyone watching would have thought this was a family overflowing with love. But families like mine don't change overnight. 2 weeks earlier, my parents had told me my degree was worthless. My father had laughed and said environmental science was just a hobby for people who wanted to feel important without actually contributing anything. My mother had sighed and reminded me again that I could have studied business like my brother, and now suddenly I was being celebrated. That alone should have scared me. The thing about growing up in the Porter family is that you learn early when something feels wrong. You learn to read silence the way other people read body language, and every instinct in my body was screaming. I sat at the long table near the center of the rooftop, smiling when people congratulated me, nodding politely as my father introduced me to his business associates, CEOs, attorneys, donors, the same people who had watched me grow up without ever really seeing me. My younger brother sat beside me, glowing as always. Caleb Porter, 20 years old, Harvard junior business major, destined heir to Porter Pharmaceuticals. He was everything my parents wanted. Brilliant, charming, obedient. The golden child. I loved him. I resented him, sometimes both at the same time. When the servers came around with drinks, my father stopped them. "I'll handle this one," he said smoothly. "For my daughter." He poured the sparkling cider himself, set the glass in front of me with a proud smile. My mother leaned in, pretending to adjust a napkin near my plate. That's when I saw it. Her hand moved too fast for anyone else to notice. A small flick of the wrist, a shimmer in the light, a fine white powder dissolving into my drink. My pulse didn't spike. My face didn't change. Because I already knew. A few nights earlier, I'd overheard my parents arguing behind my father's study door. I wasn't meant to hear it, but I did. "He already has evidence," my father had said, "and once the trust releases, he won't need us." "He's our daughter," my mother whispered. "He's a threat. Make her sick. Hospitalize her. Buy time. If she dies before the trust releases, the money comes back to us." Standing there on this rooftop, watching that poison disappear into my glass, those words echoed in my head with terrifying clarity. I picked up the glass, smiled. Then I turned to my brother. "Caleb," I said warmly, lifting it toward him, "you deserve this more than I do." He laughed, touched, completely unsuspecting, took the glass and drank every drop. That was the moment I stopped being their victim and became their reckoning. If you want to understand why I didn't scream, why I didn't knock the glass out of Caleb's hand, you need to understand how my family trained me to disappear long before that night. In the Porter household, love was a limited resource, and it had already been fully allocated before I could ever earn it. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It wasn't hidden behind excuses or softened by guilt. It was structural, built into the walls of the house, built into the way my parents spoke, the way they looked at us, the way silence followed me, and applause followed Caleb. I learned that lesson when I was 12. I came home from a cross-country meet clutching a silver medal so tightly my palm was sweating. I'd placed second in the district, my best result ever. I burst through the front door expecting foolishly that maybe this time would be different. Instead, the living room was filled with balloons. Caleb was sitting at the piano, his fingers hovering dramatically above the keys, while my parents beamed like he'd just cured cancer. He'd been invited to play at a small community event. Not a competition, not a win, just an invitation. My father glanced at my medal for half a second. "That's nice," he said, "but running won't help your career." My mother didn't even look up from adjusting Caleb's blazer. That was the day I learned the rules. Recognition wasn't something I could earn. It was something I was never meant to receive. High school only sharpened the divide. Caleb collected titles the way other kids collected hobbies: debate captain, tennis champion, valedictorian, track. Each achievement earned a celebration, photos on the wall, mentions in the local paper. I matched him academically. Sometimes I surpassed him. Science competitions, research awards, acceptance letters from every university I applied to. My accomplishments went into a drawer, out of sight, out of mind. The one time my mother attended something of mine was my sophomore year science fair. I won first place at the state level for research on antibiotic contamination in local water systems. When they handed me the trophy and cameras flashed, I felt this fragile, hopeful flutter in my chest. Maybe now. She leaned in and whispered, smiling for the photos, "You look sloppy, like you don't belong here." Whatever pride I had shattered right there on stage. My parents had already written my future without consulting me. I was supposed to study pharmaceuticals, join the company, work under Caleb, support his leadership. Anything else was treated as rebellion. When I told them I wanted to study environmental science, my father waved it off like lint on his sleeve. "People who care about pollution don't run companies," he said. "They write useless reports." When I got into UT Austin anyway, he threatened to cut me off financially. Scholarships and loans saved me, but they also branded me ungrateful in my parents' eyes. For years, I believed I was born to be Caleb's background character, except for one person, my grandmother Eleanor. She was my father's mother, a former chemist whose brilliance had quietly built the foundation of Porter Pharmaceuticals long before my father ever put his name on the building. She never fit into my parents' polished image. She spoke softly, dressed simply, and cared more about ideas than appearances. When I was 15, she took me into the basement of her old house and opened a dusty wooden trunk. Inside were stacks of handwritten research notes, formulas, early compound trials, breakthroughs that would later make the company millions. "They took my work," she told me calmly. "Then they erased my name." Her discoveries had launched the company, but in every official history she was invisible, because she was a woman. Because her success didn't fit the narrative they wanted to sell. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She smiled, eyes fierce, despite her age. "Never. Science isn't about glory, but I do regret letting others decide my worth." She was the first person who ever told me my passion wasn't small, that caring about the environment wasn't weakness, that I didn't exist to support anyone else's legacy. Before she died, she gave me one final gift, a trust fund, $8 million, in my name alone. The condition was simple. It would be released once I graduated or turned 25, whichever came first. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. My parents didn't know about it until 3 months before my graduation. An attorney mentioned it during a financial review, assuming they were already aware. I watched my father's face drain of color, watched my mother's expression harden into something sharp and cold. From that moment on, the way they looked at me changed. I wasn't just a disappointment anymore. I was a threat. The river started telling me the truth long before my parents ever did. During my final semester, I joined a field research project run by the Environmental Science Department. The study focused on sections of the Colorado River that cut through multiple industrial zones areas long rumored to be contaminated, but never conclusively proven. I chose the project partly out of passion, and partly because something in my gut told me I was circling the edge of something dangerous. At first, everything looked routine. We collected water samples at dawn sediment cores at midday, recorded pH levels, dissolved oxygen turbidity, the kind of work that feels slow until it suddenly isn't. By the second week, the numbers stopped making sense. Mercury levels were too high. Lead concentrations exceeded EPA thresholds by alarming margins. But what truly froze my blood were the trace compounds buried deeper in the data synthetic markers that didn't belong in any natural system. I recognized them instantly. They were pharmaceutical byproducts, not consumer-level residue, not runoff from households. These were untreated compounds that only appear in industrial waste from drug manufacturing plants. When I brought my findings to my supervising professor, he didn't look surprised. "We've suspected this for years," he said carefully, "but suspicion isn't proof, and proof requires courage." That night I couldn't sleep, because there was only one major pharmaceutical facility upstream from our most contaminated site. Porter Pharmaceuticals, my family's company. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself there had to be another explanation, another source, another mistake. So I dug deeper. I compared samples from different stretches of the river, tracking the current backward like a forensic trail. Each data point tightened the noose. Each test narrowed the margin for denial. Eventually, the samples led me straight to an industrial complex with a sign that made my stomach drop. West Facility Porter Pharmaceuticals. I pulled the company's publicly available wastewater treatment reports. The numbers were flawless. Too flawless. Anyone who had ever worked in a lab knew no system ran that clean that consistently. Something was being hidden. I started documenting everything. Photos of sampling locations, time-stamped readings, a private notebook filled with handwritten observations. I stored copies on encrypted drives, backed them up, and kept one version offsite. Then I found the compound that erased all doubt, an experimental derivative not yet included in standard environmental testing lists. I recognized it from internal research papers I'd seen years earlier while shadowing a lab technician during a family career exposure program. It wasn't approved, it wasn't safe, and it had no business being anywhere near a river. That was the moment the conflict stopped being theoretical. If I went public, I wouldn't just be exposing corporate corruption. I would be exposing my own parents. I wrestled with it for days. Science versus blood. Truth versus survival. I remembered my grandmother's voice steady and unflinching. Never let anyone decide your worth. I confronted them over dinner. I spread the printed data across the table, my hands shaking despite every effort to stay calm. I know what the company is doing at the West facility, I said. I have proof. If you don't stop the dumping, I will report it. The silence was immediate and absolute. My father's eyes lifted slowly, sharp and cold. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Caleb looked between us, confused, afraid. You don't understand what you're saying, my father replied. There are things bigger than you. This family survives because of silence. For the first time in my life, I didn't lower my gaze. Silence isn't family, I said. Silence is complicity. That was the moment I crossed the line. And the moment they decided I had to be eliminated. After that dinner, nothing was ever said out loud again. That was the most terrifying part. No shouting, no threats, no slammed doors. Just a sudden, chilling politeness that settled over the house like a thin layer of ice. My parents spoke to me the way people speak to strangers they don't trust. Measured, careful, smiling too much. My mother started calling more often. Not to ask about my research. Not to ask how I was holding up before graduation. Instead, she wanted to know details that had never mattered to her before. What flowers did I like? Did I prefer salmon or steak? Was there a particular dessert I wanted at the graduation dinner? My father sent me a text one afternoon while I was in the lab. Congratulations in advance. You've done something good. I stared at the screen for a long time. He had never once said anything like that to me in my entire life. The praise didn't warm me. It confirmed my fear. I doubled my precautions. I made duplicate copies of every data set one on an encrypted drive I carried with me. At all times, one stored on a secure university server and another left with my supervising professor under the guise of academic backup. I didn't tell him why, but he didn't question it. I also started paying attention. One evening as I passed my father's study, I heard raised voices. My mother's tone was tight with panic. William, are you sure this is necessary? What if someone finds out? He already has evidence, my father replied coldly, and once that trust releases, he'll never depend on us again. But she's our daughter. She's a liability. I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The FDA is already circling, he continued. If she talks, we lose everything. There was a pause. Then my father's voice dropped lower. We just need to make her sick. A few days in the hospital. While she's incapacitated, we clean the records, shift the assets. And if something goes wrong, my mother whispered. If she dies before the trust releases, he said flatly, the money reverts to us. I felt my knees weaken. They weren't arguing about whether to do it. They were negotiating acceptable outcomes. I backed away silently, forcing myself to breathe normally as I returned to the living room. I laughed at something Caleb said. I nodded along to a conversation I couldn't hear. Caleb was completely unaware. That night, he sat beside me on the couch, talking excitedly about his upcoming internship at the company. He asked almost shyly if I planned to apply to an international environmental organization after graduation. You'd be amazing at that, he said. You actually care. Something twisted painfully in my chest. Caleb wasn't part of their plan. He never had been. He was just another asset they intended to protect, even if it meant destroying me. And yet when graduation week arrived, everything moved forward as if nothing were wrong. The invitations were sent. The rooftop venue was confirmed. Lawyers, executives, donors, people who had helped build my parents' empire were all scheduled to attend. A public stage. That was when I understood. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted it to look clean. And if I survived, they wanted control. The night of my graduation, as I stepped onto the glass elevator that carried me toward the rooftop, I felt strangely calm. I had overheard their plan, which meant I had something they didn't expect. Time. And the truth. The rooftop was already alive when I stepped out of the elevator. Golden lights wrapped around the columns, casting everything in a warm glow that made even sharp edges look soft. The city stretched endlessly below us, Austin glittering like nothing in the world could ever go wrong. A jazz trio played near the bar, the low hum of conversation weaving through the music like static. To anyone watching this was love, celebration, pride. To me, it felt like walking into a beautifully staged execution. My parents spotted me immediately. Their smiles locked into place the second our eyes met. My mother glided toward me, her dress immaculate, her posture perfect. She kissed my cheek lightly, just long enough for photographers to catch it. "You look beautiful," she said, voice sweet as syrup. My father followed, clapping a hand on my shoulder for the benefit of the guests. Our girl did us proud. The lie didn't even sting anymore. Around us were the usual faces, company executives, longtime attorneys, donors who had funded my parents' philanthropic fronts. A few reporters hovered near the edges, pretending to enjoy the music while clearly listening for anything worth printing. Among them, like anchors in a hostile sea, were my friends. Jake and Mia stood near the bar, visibly out of place in a crowd that smelled like money and power. When they saw me, their relief was obvious. Jake pulled me into a tight hug. "You okay?" he murmured. I nodded just once. "Stay close." As the evening progressed, I felt my parents' attention on me constantly. Not affectionate, not proud, watchful, measuring, like predators waiting for the exact moment to strike. I noticed my father lean in and whisper to Gerald, the company's longtime attorney. Gerald nodded, then glanced at me with the detached interest of someone assessing a transaction. My skin prickled. Caleb joined me a few minutes later, radiant and relaxed, holding his drink loosely in one hand. "Everyone keeps asking me what you're doing next," he laughed. "Mom and Dad won't stop bringing it up." "Do they ever ask if you're happy?" I asked quietly. He paused, frowning. "No, that's weird, isn't it?" Before he could say more, my father raised his glass. The band softened. Conversations hushed. Servers moved into position. "This is the moment," my mother murmured, eyes never leaving me. My father took the bottle himself. A personal touch, he announced, pouring with deliberate care. "For my daughter." I watched every movement. The tilt of the bottle, the clink of glass on table, my mother leaning forward, pretending to adjust the napkin near my plate. The powder disappeared into the liquid like it had been waiting there all along. My heartbeat thundered, but my hands stayed steady. As my father lifted his glass, urging me to follow, I shifted slightly in my chair and tapped Jake's knee under the table. He looked at me sharply. "Record," I whispered. "Everything." Without hesitation, he slid his phone onto his lap and angled the camera toward us. "To Natalie," my father declared loudly. "A daughter who finally did something worth celebrating." Applause erupted. I stood lifting the poisoned glass, smiled for the cameras. Then I turned to Caleb. "Tonight isn't just about me," I said warmly. "You've always been there for me, even when things were hard. I want to share this moment with you." The crowd cooed approvingly. Caleb's face lit up. "Nat, that's wow, thank you." He took the glass without a second thought. At the same time, I picked up his untouched drink and brought it to my lips. That was when my parents' faces collapsed. My mother's hand twitched, half rising as if to stop him. My father's eyes widened, the color draining from his face so fast it was almost surreal. Too late. Caleb drank every drop. "Delicious," he said with a laugh. The band swelled back to life. Applause returned. Conversations resumed. But my parents stood frozen, their smiles cracked and brittle. Under the table, Jake squeezed my hand. The camera kept rolling, and I knew whatever happened next, they were trapped. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Caleb laughed, shook hands, accepted congratulations like he always did, effortlessly, graciously, completely unaware of the storm already breaking inside his body. My parents hovered nearby, clapping when others clapped, smiling when others smiled. But every few seconds, their eyes flicked back to him, watching, counting. I stayed still. If I moved too fast, if I showed fear, they'd know I was waiting for something. So I waited the way they'd taught me to wait my whole life, quietly, invisibly. Then Caleb's smile faltered. He pressed a hand to his chest just briefly, like he was embarrassed by the gesture. Someone asked if he was okay. He nodded too quickly. "I'm just a little dizzy," he said. Cold sweat broke out along his hairline. His skin lost its color in a way that couldn't be explained by nerves or champagne. My mother took a step forward, stopped herself. My father's jaw tightened. Caleb swayed. "I can't," he gasped, fingers clawing at the air. "My heart." He collapsed. The sound of his body hitting the floor snapped the night in half. Screams tore through the rooftop. Glass shattered. Someone yelled for an ambulance. Another guest dropped to their knees beside him, shaking, useless. I moved immediately. I knelt beside Caleb, calm in a way that shocked even me. His pulse was erratic, his breathing shallow and uneven. The symptoms lined up too perfectly. I leaned toward Jake, my voice low and controlled. "Send the video. Back it up. Cloud, now." He nodded, hands trembling, as he did exactly that. Sirens wailed in the distance within minutes. Paramedics burst onto the rooftop, shoving through panicked guests. One checked Caleb's vitals and swore under his breath. Heart arrhythmia. Respiratory distress. We need to move. Wait, I said sharply. Every head turned. I have critical information. I continued, meeting the medic's eyes without flinching. This is likely chemical poisoning, an experimental compound. Project code R17. Cyclopentylamine derivative 47. The medic froze. How do you know that? I've studied it, I said. And if you don't treat it as that, he won't make it. The medic relayed the information into his radio immediately. Behind us, my mother's voice cracked. Natalie, stop. You don't know what you're saying. I stood slowly, turning to face her. Everyone here saw who poured the drink. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. My father stepped forward. This is a family matter. The paramedic cut him off. This is now a medical emergency and a potential crime scene. Caleb was rushed onto the stretcher, oxygen mask, secured heart monitor, screaming its warning into the night. I followed as they loaded him into the ambulance. At the hospital, chaos swallowed us whole. Doctors flooded the trauma bay. IV lines were placed. Monitors beeped wildly. A physician scanned the preliminary results and looked up sharply. This looks like industrial toxin exposure. It is, I said, and there's an antidote protocol. You need to start it now. He studied my face for a split second, then nodded and barked orders. Police arrived before the antidote finished administering. They asked questions, took statements. My father tried to interrupt, failed. Caleb's vitals stabilized slowly, painfully. A doctor pulled me aside. Your information saved his life. I nodded, numb. In the waiting area, my parents sat stiffly surrounded by officers. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. My father stared at me with something new in his expression. Fear. The balance had shifted. The daughter they tried to erase had just become the one holding everything together, and the truth was finally louder than their silence. The fallout didn't creep in quietly. It detonated. By morning, the poisoning at the Porter graduation dinner was already circulating through Austin's legal and medical circles. By afternoon, reporters were camped outside the hospital. By nightfall, my phone hadn't stopped vibrating for hours. Police, attorneys, journalists, names I didn't recognize, numbers I refused to answer. Caleb remained unconscious in the ICU machines, breathing and counting for him. Every time I looked through the glass at his still body, the weight of what almost happened pressed down on me until my chest ached. Whatever resentment I'd ever felt toward him dissolved into something simpler and heavier. He hadn't deserved any of this. Neither of us had. Within 24 hours, the FBI joined the investigation. Officially, it was about the poisoning. Unofficially, it was about something much larger, something the agents didn't bother hiding once they sat across from me in a sterile interview room. They already knew. Not everything, but enough. They asked about the West facility, about the river, about compounds that never should have left the lab. When I placed my encrypted drive on the table, the room went very still. This is everything I said. Raw data, locations, timestamps, photos, independent backups. One of the agents exhaled slowly. You have any idea what this means? Yes, I replied. It means you're about to find out how deep it goes. The search warrant was executed the next morning. Porter Pharmaceuticals' headquarters was sealed off before most employees even arrived for work. FBI tape wrapped the glass doors like a warning label. Agents carried out boxes of documents, servers, hard drives. The image flooded every major news outlet within hours. Then came the whistleblower. An anonymous email landed in the FBI's inbox from a senior research scientist who had worked on Project R17. He wrote that adverse reaction data had been altered, that lab animal deaths had been erased, that anyone who questioned it was reassigned or silenced. He had copies of the original reports. The agents traced the archive to a hidden internal server. That was when the empire began to collapse. Toxicology results confirmed what I already knew. The compound found in Caleb's bloodstream matched the experimental drug Porter Pharmaceuticals had quietly suspended years earlier due to fatal side effects. None of those findings had ever been reported to regulators. Environmental investigators followed the paper trail next. They found shipping records that didn't align, disposal logs that contradicted each other, and finally a warehouse outside the city where untreated chemical waste had been buried directly into the ground soil, blackened and poisoned beyond recovery. The river had known first. The video Jake recorded at the party became the final nail. Frame by frame, investigators watched my mother's hand hover over the glass, watched the exchange, watched my parents' faces when the drinks were switched. It wasn't perfect footage. It didn't need to be. When I sat across from federal investigators, my voice didn't shake. My parents didn't just try to poison me, I said. They tried to erase the truth. I refused to let them. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. Pharmaceutical CEO and wife under investigation for attempted murder fraud and environmental crimes. Porter Pharmaceuticals, once untouchable, was now radioactive. And the family that had spent decades controlling the narrative had finally lost control of the truth. The trial began 9 months later in a federal courtroom so cold and bright it felt surgically designed to strip emotion from the room. My parents sat at the defendant's table in matching dark suits, composed, controlled, still clinging to the illusion that power could shield them. My mother's hair was perfectly styled. My father's posture was rigid, his jaw set like this was just another board meeting he intended to dominate. I didn't look at them. I focused on the flag behind the judge's bench, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, on the fact that I was here alive when they had tried to make sure I wouldn't be. Their defense was exactly what I expected. This was a tragic accident, their attorney declared. A misunderstanding fueled by a disgruntled daughter who wanted to destroy her family and seize an inheritance. I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. The prosecution dismantled them piece by piece. They showed the video from the rooftop, the toxicology reports, the falsified lab data, emails ordering scientists to erase adverse reactions, maps of environmental contamination lighting up the courtroom screen like a constellation of crimes. The room murmured, cameras clicked, pens scratched furiously across notepads. Then Caleb took the stand. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, still recovering. But when he met my eyes, there was something steady there that hadn't existed before. I trusted my parents, he said, voice breaking just once. I trusted them completely. And they poisoned me. They meant it for my sister. My mother sobbed loudly. My father didn't move. The final blow came with an email projected onto the screen. Eliminate all adverse reaction data. If not, this project is dead. My father's name sat beneath it. The courtroom went silent. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. When they returned, I stood. Guilty, the foreperson said, on all counts. Conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, document forgery, gross violations of environmental law. The judge's gavel came down with a crack that echoed through my bones. Sentences were handed down swiftly. Assets frozen, corporate control seized, Porter Pharmaceuticals placed under court supervision, pending dissolution. I closed my eyes as the weight of it finally lifted. Not because they were punished, but because the truth had won. The world didn't end when my parents were sentenced. It just moved on. The headlines burned hot for a few weeks. Pharmaceutical dynasty falls, parents poison son at graduation, environmental crimes, Rock, Texas, then slowly gave way to newer scandals, newer outrage. That was the part that surprised me the most. How quickly devastation becomes background noise once it stops being entertaining. My father received 15 years in federal prison. My mother received 12. No chance of parole until they served the majority of their sentences. The judge made sure of that. Porter Pharmaceuticals was seized, every account frozen. Operations shut down. Over 2,000 employees lost their jobs, and that part haunted me longer than I expected. Not because the company deserved saving, but because innocent people had been caught in the collapse of something rotten. Some structures can't be repaired. They have to fall. The mansion I grew up in was auctioned off within months. $2.3 million. I drove past it once after the sale. Didn't stop, didn't feel anything. My grandmother's trust was released the week after the verdict. $8 million. I didn't touch most of it. Instead, I moved into the small lakeside house she'd left me years earlier, a wooden cabin overlooking Lake Travis. Nothing flashy, just quiet. The first night there, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the sun sink into the water. I didn't check my phone. I didn't replay the trial in my head. For the first time in my life, I breathed. Caleb moved in with me after he was discharged from the hospital. The poisoning had damaged his heart. He'd need monitoring for at least a year, but he was alive and different. One evening, about a week after he arrived, he sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a glass of water like he needed the weight of it. "I'm not finishing my business degree," he said quietly. "I'm applying to law school, environmental law." I didn't argue. I didn't congratulate him. I just nodded. That was enough. 3 months later, I used part of the inheritance to establish a foundation in my grandmother's name. We funded medical care for families affected by the contamination and offered scholarships to students studying environmental science and public health. 200 families helped in the first year alone. The extended family surfaced exactly when I knew they would. Aunts, uncles, cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years, all suddenly concerned, all suddenly interested in reconciliation, in forgiveness, in sticking together. I blocked them all. The letters came next. My mother wrote first. 3 pages, apologies, explanations, blame softened into regret. She said she prayed for me every day. I read it once, then I burned it. My father's letter arrived a week later. No remorse, just anger, accusations, claims that I'd destroyed the family legacy. I didn't finish reading it. The fire took care of that, too. The letter stopped after 2 months. Last fall, Caleb received his acceptance letter. Full scholarship, UT Austin, environmental law. He stood on the porch, holding the envelope, smiling in a way I'd never seen before. Like he wasn't performing. Like he was finally choosing something for himself. That night, we sat by the lake as the sky darkened. We survived, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, and that's enough. If you stayed until the end, thank you. Some stories aren't about revenge. They're about refusing to disappear.